Family Dollar is now closing 1,000 of its locations because people can't afford to shop at Family Dollar. The company's CEO just yesterday said, and I quote, Family Dollar is a victim of the macro environment out there. But isn't that the booming, no landing environment? What does it say about the real state of the real economy that people can't afford to shop at these dollar stores? What it does say is that, among other things, higher oil prices are not inflationary. We've got more recession signals in consumer spending. We've got these dollar store reports. We've got U.S. retail sales that back up the dollar store reports. And why oil prices are not inflationary as everyone goes right back into full-blown inflation panic mode, thanks to Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. So we'll start out with Family Dollar. The company yesterday in its earnings report said, we're going to have to close 600 stores this year and then another 370 stores over the coming years. And the parent company, Dollar Tree, they're going to close 30 of their stores as their leases come due. And the most mainstream commentary surrounding Family Dollar's struggle has focused on that merger between Dollar Tree and Family Dollar, which was indeed troubled from the very beginning all the way going back to 2015. However, as we'll see, it really is the macro environment. As the company's CEO, Rick Drayling, said, persistent inflation and reduced government benefits continue to pressure the lower income consumers that comprise a sizable portion of Family Dollar's customer base. So as Family Dollar, which hasn't been able to hold its prices down as much as its competitors, so as Family Dollar has struggled, and of course Dollar Tree has struggled too, it has led to this idea that maybe Dollar General is booming. This is just Family Dollar and not the entire retail area. But Dollar General just reported its earnings earlier today, and they were quite a bit like Family Dollar's. From the earnings release from Dollar General, it says net sales decreased 3.4% to $9.9 billion in the fourth quarter of fiscal 2023, compared to $10.2 billion in the fourth quarter of fiscal 2022, because that included net sales for a 53rd week of about $700 million. The net sales decrease was primarily driven by the period containing one less week of sales than the prior year period, as well as the impact of store closures, partially offset by positive sales contribution from new stores and growth in same-store sales. But here's the thing. Those same-store sales only increased by 0.7% year over year compared to the fourth quarter of last year. And those are not price-adjusted numbers, keep in mind. That was driven by an increase in customer traffic, but partially offset by a decrease in average transaction amount, which is something that the Family Dollar CEO also brought up. Customers are going to the dollar store, and they're going to the dollar store more frequently, but they're spending less when they get there. They can't afford to buy the same amount of stuff that they had been buying up to then. Consumers are really struggling. And in a actually booming economy, the expression "a rising tide lifts all boats," in a legitimately booming economy, soft landing, no landing, whatever the case may be, Family Dollar would be experiencing a renaissance, as would any of the retailers, any of the high-end retailers, any of the mid-tier retailers, as well as the low-end. A real economic boom, especially where the labor market is strong and resilient, and lots of wage gains, you wouldn't be seeing this type of struggle all across the retail segment of the United States economy. Of course, it goes around the rest of the world too. But why are consumers struggling? And the reason they're struggling is because the labor market is struggling and because they can't afford to pay higher gasoline prices. Consumer price pressures are indeed one of the biggest factors here, but they're not inflation, and the oil prices are not inflationary. And we're getting reminded of that and more data backing up the idea in the form of U.S. retail sales for the month of February. Now, remember retail sales leading up to this month, leading up to, from October through January, they had been increasingly worrisome. We go back to last October, September and October, you could tell something had changed in the real economy. Markets shifted. We got all sorts of corporate warnings, especially in the retail space, that said, hey, we don't like what's going on here. Something bad seems to be coming. Well, then retail sales, well, they stumbled in October. It looked better in November. It looked even better in December, and then January was a big downturn. But like we see in the payroll reports, Census Bureau has been engaging in downward revisions in retail sales too. Substantial downward revisions that we also have to factor in as well. The initial estimate for October retail sales, remember these are in nominal terms, was a minus 0.11% month over month change. That was bad enough. It was a negative number. It's since been revised lower, of course, to minus 0.25%. November came out positive. It seemed like consumers were coming to the rescue of the Christmas season as it was increasingly dark. The initial retail sales figure was 0.35% in November. That's since been revised to a negative number too, a very small negative, 0.03%. So, but that meant that you had two straight negatives to start out the Christmas shopping season. But then along comes December. The initial retail sales figure for December plus 0.55%. And it seemed like, okay, Americans are not buying for Christmas in October and November, but they came in at the last minute and splurged just a little bit to save the Christmas season. That was the verdict that we got from all the mainstream media reports after Census put out these estimates. Well, after a couple revisions since then, including the latest one that just came out today, December was just 0.11% positive, but barely, which means that for the entire fourth quarter of last year, nominal retail sales were negative. It really was a bust of a Christmas season, and even worse, it backs up everything that we've been saying about the recessionary economy and corroborating a whole bunch of this other data, including the dollar stores, what they're talking about. Then came the big decline. Remember the big decline in January. Initially, that was thought to be minus 0.83%. But now Census says no, is actually even worse. It's minus 1.05%. So you got the decline in the fourth quarter and then a huge decline in January that was even bigger than originally thought. The latest figure for February is a plus sign, plus 0.58%, which is on the one side positive at the very least, but it doesn't even get back the entirety of the January decline. And even worse, the real point here, do we even trust the 0.58%? Because look at what happened to December. December was supposed to be a rebound, at least it was supposed to have been at the initial estimate. Instead, what was a 0.55 in December is now basically zero or close to zero at 0.11. So how, do we even trust February 0.58? Because like the payroll reports, there's a growing tendency to really revise these downward moving forward. And it doesn't matter if they don't revise it downward because, again, as you can see from the retail sales numbers, going back to last October, consumers in America are indeed struggling. It's not just a couple CEOs. It's not Family Dollar's corporate struggles. It really is coming out in the data too. And we know why that is. As I mentioned, the labor market is incredibly weak. We know there has been a hiring freeze. It's very difficult to find a job here. We know that many people have seen their hours cut. The full-time to part-time shift that shows up in the household survey. And then the rest of the household survey has shown that maybe there are indeed substantial layoffs taking place. And that has an enormous chilling effect all across the economy. Not just those workers who are affected by being laid off or those workers who are affected by having their hours cut. Even if you don't have either of those happen to you, you're looking around and thinking, I might need to tighten my belt anyway because I might be next, either having my hours cut or maybe even being laid off. At the very least, you know there isn't an opportunity to go elsewhere and get a better paying job or to get maybe the raise that you were counting on. The entire labor market has shifted to the opposite side of the spectrum where people are more and more concerned, and we are seeing that chilling effect come up in consumer spending. That's big economic trouble moving forward. But in addition to labor market struggle, the real issue here is the supply shock and how oil prices and all the prices that went skyrocketing in 2021 and 2022 were not actually inflation. And I know most people don't care about this terminology. Consumer prices went up and looks like they're staying up, so who cares where it has come from? And the answer is because there's a huge difference in how it turns out. Actually, legitimate inflation would be more like the 1970s, which we keep hearing time and time again, only it doesn't happen to be like the 1970s. Whereas a supply shock ends up with what we see today, which is essentially that especially when it comes to oil prices, when oil prices go up, we have to pay them. Except in the most extreme circumstances where oil prices then do create demand destruction. As I mentioned in a recent video, demand for oil is largely price inelastic. We have to pay higher oil prices because we need energy. However, as we're paying more for oil prices, we have less to spend on everything else. And so the entire rest of the economy actually suffers for having to pay more for energy. That's not inflationary. That is deflationary over time, because the rest of the economy suffers by robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so as the rest of the economy suffers, what happens? Well, businesses in that rest of the economy have to start cutting their costs. They don't pass them along to consumers because consumers can't afford to pay them. So businesses then cut their costs, which leads to lower income, which makes the problem even worse, and round we go. It's the opposite of what people have in mind for oil prices. And you can understand where this comes from, this common perception of oil being inflationary. First of all, part of it derives from a misreading of the 1970s Great Inflation. Many people believe that the Great Inflation was in major part, if not entirely, due to the oil price shocks of that period, when actually it was these oil price shocks on top of real inflation. You had the real money and credit creation, out of control money and credit creation, that was the underlying fundamental inflation during the entire Great Inflationary period. And then on top of that, you had these two massive supply shocks. One in 1973, when the Great Inflation was almost 8 years old by then, and one in 1979 up until 1980. And rather than create more inflation, those oil price shocks contributed to consumer price growth at the initial stage and then actually led to recessions. Because while you had the underlying inflation raging the entire time, oil prices meant we had to pay more for energy and therefore had less to spend on everything else. So the 1970s was not inflationary because of oil prices. It was inflationary despite oil prices. That just made the misery that much more miserable. And then there's this intuitive part of oil prices as inflation too, because as I just mentioned, you can't get away from energy costs. And so from a business perspective, as your input costs go up, and energy is a huge part of pretty much everything you do, you're going to want to pass those costs on to consumers. And consumer prices go up. As they pay higher costs, that's inflation. And then, of course, consumers go to their work and say, I need a higher wage rate in order to absorb all these higher costs. And that gets into what economists and policymakers fear maybe the most, which is this wage price spiral. And the wage price spiral is simply the way to close this loop between higher input costs and inflationary prices. Because what's theorized is that as prices go up and businesses pass those costs along to consumers, consumers are able to absorb those higher costs across the board because they're getting paid more in wage rates. And so as they're getting paid more in wage rates, that means not only will they absorb higher costs, it also means that businesses are going to want to raise their prices even further because now their wage costs have gone up in addition to whatever caused the initial price spike. And just round and round it goes. It sounds like there's an intuitive process there, that oil prices lead to this wage price spiral. And in Japan, which is a perfect example right now, that's exactly what they're paying most attention to. But that's exactly the wrong thing to pay attention to because that's not how inflation works. As I've said all along, we only need to look at the monetary system, the credit system. We see that in the credit statistics. We see it in the bond market. There was no excessive money printing, no excessive sustained credit creation throughout the global economy, the US either. And because there wasn't sustained credit creation, we have part of the 1970s. We have the supply shock from oil without the underlying monetary inflation. So that's exactly what we've seen. We've got the supply shock where people's incomes have fallen further and further behind. As they pay more for energy and food and other costs, they have less to spend everywhere else. And without the monetary inflation to make that possible, it just leads to more and more demand destruction. We pay more for oil, but we have less available for everything else. And as the supply shock comes down, businesses are unable to pass along their costs to consumers, consumer price increases slow down, as we've talked about in the all items less shelter. That has been solidly disinflationary since the oil price shock back in 2022, which is telling you companies have been unable to pass along price increases. Their profits begin to become weaker and weaker. And as their profits become weaker and weaker, what do? They cut costs in other ways. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last several months as well, really going back to last summer. Again, as I said before, that means no hiring freeze. It means fewer hours worked among those workers that are still employed. And eventually it means cutting back on workers. And we've seen all three of those things develop over the last little while here. So it's not inflation. And it's a consistent picture of the downside to the supply shock. Okay, so would the dollar stores actually be struggling this badly if the economy was truly booming, if it was inflationary, as everyone says? I mean, Family Dollar cutting so many stores because they can't hold down prices enough for their customers. Dollar General, the big one. They've said, we're seeing more customers. They keep coming back to our stores, but they're spending less when they get there because they don't have enough income to keep up. And the reason they don't is because the labor market is weak and because they're spending more on necessities, leaving them less for everything else, which is the downward side of the supply shock that we see in every historical instance. So rather than be afraid of the latest CPI or PPI, we go through these every couple months where a hot CPI or high PPI number comes in and everybody freaks out about inflation. Here comes oil prices generating inflationary pressures, only to see those to fade rather quickly over the months ahead. And the reason they fade rather quickly is because it's not inflation. It is, in fact, recession. We got more recession signals in the labor market. Now we've got recession signals in consumer spending. We've got recession signals from the dollar stores who tell us that their customers can't afford to shop at the dollar stores. I mentioned recession signals. We got 3 very strong recession signals from the labor data, not the establishment survey, the household survey, including the unemployment rate. That's the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.